to Russia, tens of thousands of opposition supporters rallied in Moscow on Saturday, one of the largest authorized protests ever under President Vladimir Putin. The crowd gathered to demand officials allow independent candidates on the ballot in the upcoming municipal elections. A protest monitoring group says more than 300 people were arrested across the country. In recent weeks, thousands have attended street protests calling for free elections after the exclusion of several opposition figures. Russia expert Anna Borshchevskaya joins the program now. She is a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, as well as a fellow at the European Foundation for Democracy. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. Now, Moscow local elections normally don't garner this much attention. Was this protest movement really sparked by the barring of these politicians, or had it been simmering for a while?
These issues have been simmering for a while. The immediate spark, of course, was the barring of these independent candidates from local elections. But the fact of the matter is, protest activity in Russia has been going on and off for the last several years. These are the largest protests, but ultimately they didn't come out of the blue. This has been brewing for a while.
Now, the last time Russia saw protests this size, in fact, even bigger, was in 2011 and 2012, and those were also over the election process in the country. Are there connections between then and now?
Well, I think we're seeing that there's certainly a lot of echoes. The protests in 2011, 2012 were larger, but there are many similarities. And ultimately, the issues are the same, and that is corruption, government accountability, frustration with the government inability to deliver what it promised.
We're seeing the most attention and the biggest protests happening in Moscow, where it was initially sparked. But how is this movement spreading outside of Moscow to other cities, big and small?
It does seem to be spreading, and that's another similarity with 2011, 2012, where the protests were not only in large cities, not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg. What's also interesting is the government reaction. The crackdown on the protesters is really unprecedented. In fact, I don't believe it was even that bad in 2011, 2012. The violence that the government is using is really nothing like we've seen in recent years. And that shows you just how worried the Kremlin is.
And we've heard the Kremlin also insinuate that this isn't necessarily a homegrown movement.
That's right. That's exactly right. And this is also a traditional Kremlin theme. The Kremlin always accuses the West, mainly the United States, of quote unquote fomenting regime change, because it's so hard for the Putin regime to imagine that protesters will come out on their own, which is in fact, that's the reality. That's what's happening. Back in 2011, 2012, Putin went as far as say that then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton gave the signal for protesters to come out. There hasn't been a statement like that, but the Russian Foreign Affairs Ministry accused the United States Embassy of interfering in local processes and fomenting unrest, because they had included the opposition call to protest in their warning to American citizens, and that again shows you that the Kremlin just doesn't see what's happening in reality.
Russia expert Anna Borshchevskaya, thank you so much for joining us here on France 24.